One night, a stranger asked for a room. A woman said yes, and a village would spend years arguing with the consequences. A man passed through a muaku, shared a roof meant for women, and left a child behind without leaving his name. What began as hospitality would become shame, silence, and judgment. Long after the stranger vanished down the road, his absence would speak louder than his presence ever did. The stranger arrived at dusk, when cooking fires were dying down and doors were beginning to close. He stood at the entrance of a compound where only women lived, his travel bag dusty, his voice respectful. When Nairu opened the door, he greeted her and asked for a place to sleep, explaining that night had overtaken his journey. She hesitated. But hospitality is a law that does not wait for comfort. Nkairu told him there was space. Though the compound had not welcomed a man in many seasons, it was her mother's house, now shared by women who depended on one another. The stranger thanked her calmly, as if the answer had already been decided. When he stepped inside, no one imagined the house would remember him. The man called himself Ishu, though he did not explain where he came from or where he was going. He ate quietly, listened carefully, and spoke only when spoken to. His manner was gentle, neither hurried nor demanding. And Kairu noticed how easily he settled, like someone used to being allowed in. Night came without ceremony, heavy with heat and insects. The women retired to their rooms, trusting the familiar safety of shared walls. Nkairu remained awake longer than usual, her thoughts restless, without clear reason. Sleep, when it came loosely, as if unsure of its place. What passed between Nairu and the stranger did not announce itself as trouble. There was no force, no promise, no plan spoken aloud. It happened quietly, carried by closeness and the forgetting that night sometimes encourages. Before morning, the moment had already begun to loosen its grip. Isu rose before the sun and left without waking anyone. The mat he slept on cooled quickly, and the road accepted him without question. By the time Nkairu noticed his absence, the village was already stirring. Nothing looked broken, and that made it easier to believe nothing was wrong. Life resumed its usual rhythm, because villages survive by continuing. Nkiru swept the yard, fetched water, and joined conversations as before. She carried herself carefully, though she did not yet know why. Only the quiet stayed with her longer than usual. Days passed, then weeks, and the village marked time as it always had. It was Nkiru's body that changed first, not her face or her speech. Food lost its appeal, and fatigue followed her even after rest. Still, she said nothing, because some truths ask to be certain before they speak. When her monthly flow did not return, fear finally found its voice. Nairu waited, counted days, and waited again. By the time the swelling became undeniable, the truth no longer needed words. She was with child, and the knowledge settled heavily inside her. In Amoaku, pregnancy was welcomed, but this one arrived alone. Questions followed, gently at first, then with concern, edged by fear. When asked who the father was, Naikiru looked toward the road and remained silent. The silence did more harm than any careless answer. Word reached Okari, her uncle, and elder of her lineage. He called her in and asked the question without anger or softness. Nkairu told him what she could and what she could not. A child without a named father, Okori knew, never belonged to only one person. The elders gathered beneath the Udala tree, where difficult matters rested. Hospitality had been offered, yes, but boundaries had blurred. One night had entered the village and refused to leave. The elders understood that silence would soon demand a response. Women whispered among themselves, weighing sympathy against fear. Some remembered their own youth and the softness of nights that asked for nothing. Others worried about order, lineage, and what such a child might bring. Taboos, once stirred, do not wait patiently. Only Obina approached Nkairu without caution. He asked where the man had gone, and whether she wished he had stayed. Nkairu told him that absence can be heavier than presence. Obina listened, though listening changed nothing. As months passed, Nkiru's belly grew, and the village waited. Greetings became measured, glances longer, silences thicker. The child moved freely, unaware of the tension waiting beyond birth. Everyone knew the matter was unfinished. When labor came earlier than expected, Amuaku understood that waiting was over. Women gathered, men, stood back, and the drums were taken down. This child would arrive carrying more than life, and as the village prepared for dawn, it knew that one night of kindness had begun asking its full price. Labor did not ask permission before it began. It arrived like a visitor who knows the door is already open. Enkiru felt the first pain while pounding yam, sharp enough to steal her breath and make her grip the pestle for balance. The women around her noticed the change in her face before she spoke, because pain announces itself even when the mouth stays closed. Someone took the pestle from her hand, and another led her toward the inner room without questions. In Omuaku, when labor begins, the village rearranges itself quietly. The women gathered with practiced hands and steady voices, tying wrappers and warming water as if repetition could calm the air. They spoke to Enkiru softly, telling her to breathe, telling her she was not alone, even if everyone knew the child's arrival carried weight beyond blood. Outside, men lingered at a distance, pretending to be busy with nothing in particular. The drums remained silent, hanging where they were, waiting to be told what kind of birth this would be. Silence, once again, took its seat among them. As the pains grew stronger, Enkiru's thoughts wandered to the night that had started everything. She did not see the stranger's face clearly anymore, only the outline of his presence and the ease with which he had left. She wondered if he had ever thought of Omuaku again, or if the road had already erased them both. The pain returned before she could finish the thought, dragging her back into her body. Some questions, she realized, wait for answers that never come. The child announced itself just before dawn, arriving with a cry that was thin but determined. The women exchanged quick looks, relief passing briefly across their faces before caution returned. A child born alive was a blessing, but blessings can still carry conditions. They cleaned the baby carefully and placed it in Enkiru's arms, watching her face closely. Enkiru looked down, and for a moment, everything else loosened its grip. Word traveled fast once the sun rose. Because birth cannot be hidden for long, people asked first whether the child lived, then whether it was a boy or a girl, and finally the question no one wanted to voice directly. Whose child was it? The women answered what they could and kept the rest behind their lips. In Omuaku, a child belongs to the village, but a father gives the village permission to rejoice. Okori arrived later that morning, his steps measured and his face unreadable. He stood at the doorway and looked at the child, tin at Enkiru, as if weighing two heavy things at once. He did not speak immediately, because words chosen too quickly often return with regret. When he finally spoke, it was only to ask how she felt. Enkiru answered him honestly, though honesty did not lighten the room. The elders were informed before the child finished its first sleep. They gathered beneath the udala tree, as they had before, but the matter now had a face and a cry. Maziezanwa reminded them that a living child complicates judgment, because life has a way of asking for mercy. Others spoke of precedent, of rules that had protected Omuaku from confusion for generations. Between mercy and order, the space grew narrow. Women stood together nearby, pretending to talk about other things, while listening closely. Some felt their hearts pulled toward Enkiru, remembering how easily one night can slip out of its place. Others feared what bending the rules might invite, because rules, once bent, rarely return to their original shape. A village survives by remembering what it has agreed to. Fear. Agreement, however, is never complete. Obina visited Enkiru in the quiet of the afternoon, bringing water and saying little. He looked at the child with careful eyes, as if searching for a familiar shape in an unfamiliar face. He asked whether she had thought of naming the child. Enkiru said names carry expectations, and she was not ready to give the child a burden it could not yet carry. By evening, the priest poured libation and spoke to the ancestors with deliberate care. He asked them to see the child before judging the mistake that brought it. He reminded them that Omuaku had always survived by balancing law with patience. The wind moved gently through the trees, offering no clear answer. Silence, again, refused to take sides. The elders reached a temporary decision as night settled. Enkiru and the child would remain under observation until the next market day, when a full judgment would be made. If the father was not named by then, the village would perform a cleansing ritual to protect itself. It was not punishment, they said, but protection. Enkiru heard the words and understood how easily protection can wound. That night, Nahiru held her child close and listened to its breathing. Love rose in her quietly, without permission, without logic. She wondered what kind of world demands payment from those who cannot yet speak. As sleep finally claimed her, one thought remained awake. Before the market drums sounded again, Amuaku would ask her for a truth she did not know how to give. Market day arrived, with the patience of something that knew it could not be avoided. From early morning, people moved about more deliberately, as though their feet were measuring the weight of the day. Baskets were packed, goats tied, and greetings exchanged with extra care. Even the air felt watchful, as if it too wanted to hear what would be said. Ankairu woke before the first cockcrow, the child sleeping lightly against her chest. She washed herself slowly and wrapped the baby in clean cloth, choosing the softest one she owned. Her hands did not shake, though her thoughts did. Fear, she had learned, does not always announce itself with trembling. The path to the market square was already busy when she stepped outside. Women paused in their conversations as she passed, and men lowered their voices without meaning to. No one blocked her way, yet no one walked beside her either. A person carrying an unfinished matter often walks alone. The market square stood open and wide, but it felt smaller than usual. Mats were spread for the elders beneath the Udala tree, and the priest sat near the shrine with his staff across his knees. Traders waited with their goods, uncertain whether buying and selling would truly happen. When judgment walks into a place, business learns to stand still. The elders arrived one by one, their faces calm, their steps slow. They did not hurry, because the village had waited long enough. Mazia Zanwa cleared his throat and spoke first, reminding everyone why they had gathered. A child had been born, and the village still did not know its road. Until that road was named, Amuaku could not walk freely. Ankiru was called forward, and she came, adjusting the child on her shoulder. The baby stirred, but did not cry, as if it sensed the carefulness of the moment. The elders asked again what they had asked before, this time without anger or softness. Who was the father of the child? And Kairu answered with the truth she had carried from the beginning. The man was a stranger, a traveler who stayed one night and left before dawn. She did not know his village, his people, or the road he took after a moment. Her voice did not rise or fall. It simply stayed. A murmur moved through the crowd, low and restless. Some shook their heads, others sighed, and a few looked away. A stranger without a name is difficult, but a stranger without a direction is worse. The elders listened carefully, because listening does not always mean agreeing. One elder spoke of compassion, reminding the gathering that hospitality had invited the trouble inside. Another spoke of order, warning that rules ignored today return as chaos tomorrow. Each word landed with weight, because both sides spoke truth. The village stood between what it felt and what it feared. The priest rose slowly and addressed the people. He said the ancestors had been patient so far, but patience is not permission. A cleansing ritual was meant to restore balance, not to destroy a life. Still, balance sometimes asks for sacrifice, even when sacrifice is unfair. At the mention of the ritual, the crowd shifted uneasily. The ceremony was old, rarely used, and remembered mostly through stories. It required separation, confession, and the acknowledgement of broken boundaries. It did not always harm the body, but it always marked the spirit. Inkiro listened without interrupting, her hand resting on the child's back. She understood that the ritual would not be about her alone. It would speak to the village's fear of loosened edges and wandering lines. What frightened her was not the ritual itself, but what it would teach her child about belonging. Obina stepped forward before he had fully decided to do so. He asked permission to speak, and the elders nodded, surprised but curious. He said the village was right to protect itself, but protection should not begin by isolating the innocent. A child, he reminded them, does not choose the road it is born onto. Some nodded at his words, while others frowned. Youth speaks boldly, but boldness does not always carry authority. Still, the elders did not silence him, because truth sometimes arrives without age. Obina finished by saying that if the village feared confusion, it should fear cruelty more. The elders withdrew briefly to consult among themselves. The crowd waited, shifting from foot to foot, trading glances and whispers. The market stalls remained untouched, because no one felt free to bargain yet. Judgment, once begun, does not allow distraction. When the elders returned, their decision came carefully shaped. The cleansing ritual would proceed, but in a limited form. Nkiru would remain in the village, and the child would not be harmed or hidden. Instead, the village would mark the child as belonging to a Muaku until a father could be named or claimed. Relief and uncertainty moved through the crowd together. The ritual would protect the village, they said, while allowing Mercy room to breathe. Still, the mark placed on the child would follow it into the future. A child can grow, but a label grows faster. The priest announced that the ritual would take place at the next full moon. Until then, Nkiru and the child would live under observation, neither celebrated nor rejected. The village would watch. And watching, too, has a weight. Nkiru bowed her head, accepting what she could not change. As people slowly returned to their stalls, the market resumed with careful energy. Voices rose again. Though softer than usual, life, once interrupted, insists on continuing. Yet everyone knew the matter had not ended, only paused. That Ebenine Nkiru sat outside her hut and watched the sky deepen into night. The child slept peacefully, unaware of the discussions it had stirred. Nkiru wondered what it meant to belong somewhere that had to decide whether to keep you. She held the child closer, knowing the next moon would ask even more of them both. Far down the road beyond Amuaku, a traveler walked beneath the same sky, unaware of the names spoken in his absence. The road carried him forward without judgment, as roads often do. But in Umwaku the future had begun to gather itself, and before the full moon rose, the village would learn whether rules protect people or whether people must sometimes reshape the rules to survive. The days leading to the full moon stretched longer than usual, as if time itself was being careful. People spoke politely, but watched closely, and every small action felt examined. Nkiru noticed how greetings now came with pauses, how kindness arrived mixed with caution. The village had agreed on mercy, but mercy, once questioned, never moves freely. Nkiru stayed mostly within the compound, not because she was told to, but because movement invited attention. She bathed the child, fed it, and learned the quiet language of its needs. Motherhood settled into her body more easily than fear had. Still, each laugh or cry felt like a reminder that the village had not finished deciding what this child meant. The child was named quietly, without ceremony or announcement. Nkiru chose the name Chidabear, meaning that mercy lives somewhere, even if it must be searched for. She spoke the name only inside the hut, letting it grow familiar on her tongue. A name given softly still carries power. Women came by in small numbers, often alone, bringing food or sitting briefly before leaving. Some asked about the child's health, and nothing more. Others lingered, testing the ground for conversation about the ritual. Fear makes people curious, but curiosity rarely comes without judgment.
Obina visited often, sometimes bringing firewood, sometimes just sitting in silence. He watched how naturally Nkiru moved with the child, and wondered why the village struggled to see what was already clear. He spoke carefully, because words spoken too boldly can harden ears. Even so, his presence was noticed. Among the elders, discussions continued without conclusion. Some argued that the limited ritual was already too much concession. Others felt the village had avoided a greater wrong by choosing restraint. Tradition, they agreed, was strong because it could endure questioning, but only to a point. The priest spent long hours at the shrine, speaking less and listening more. He poured libation with steady hands and waited for signs that refused to hurry. The ancestors, it seemed, were neither angry nor pleased, only attentive. Attention, the priest knew, was its own warning. As the moon grew fuller, the village grew quieter. Children were told not to wander far, and songs were kept low. The ritual did not require fear, but fear often arrives on its own. When people prepare for judgment, even mercy begins to feel sharp. On the evening before the ritual, Nkiru was summoned to meet the elders privately. She went with the child strapped to her back, her steps steady but slow. They asked her again about the stranger, probing gently for details that might lead somewhere. Nkiru answered honestly, and honesty led nowhere. Masiezenwa studied her for a long moment before speaking. He asked whether she believed the man would ever return. Nkiru said she did not know, and that not knowing had become part of her life. The elder nodded, because uncertainty is a companion he recognized. That night Nkiru did not sleep easily. She listened to the breathing of the compound and the distant sounds of night insects. Her thoughts returned to the stranger, not with longing, but with unfinished questions. Some people enter your life only to leave work behind. The full moon rose round and bright, casting long shadows across a moor. People gathered near the shrine, forming a wide circle that left space at the center. The air was calm, but no one mistook calm for ease. Rituals do not need noise to command attention. Nkiru stood where she was told, holding Chidibert close. The priest began with prayers that reminded the village of its shared roots. He spoke of boundaries, of hospitality, and of responsibility. Each word landed gently, but firmly. The ritual itself was brief and restrained. There was no shouting, no punishment, no spectacle. Nkiru was asked to acknowledge the broken boundary, and the village acknowledged its part in welcoming the stranger. The child was lifted briefly, presented not as a problem, but as a life in need of direction. When it ended, the priest declared that balance had been addressed, though balance is never fully restored in one night. The village exhaled, some with relief, others with lingering doubt. The moon watched without comment. Rituals, close moments, not stories. In the days that followed, life resumed again, though altered. Nkiru was no longer avoided, but she was not fully embraced either. Chidibert grew stronger, his presence becoming ordinary in a way that both comforted and unsettled people. Ordinary things often challenge beliefs more than dramatic ones. Obina noticed the shift most clearly. Conversations resumed around Nkiru, but stopped just short of inclusion. The child was greeted, but rarely held. Acceptance, he realized, was being measured out slowly, like something expensive. One afternoon, a trader passing through the village paused longer than usual. He mentioned a young man who matched a stranger's description, seen weeks earlier near the river settlements. The detail was small, uncertain, and easily dismissed. Yet it moved through Omuaku like a ripple. By evening, the rumor had reached the elders. A stranger with a familiar shadow had been seen again, not far away. No one knew whether the story was true, but truth has a way of announcing itself through repetition. The question that had been quieted now lifted its head. Nkiru heard the whisper and felt something tighten inside her. The road she thought had closed now seemed open again. She did not know whether to hope or to fear. Some answers, once found, create new questions. As night settled, Omuaku returned to its watchful quiet. The ritual had passed, but the story had not. Somewhere beyond the village, a man walked unaware that his footsteps were being remembered. And within Omuaku the village prepared itself. Because if the stranger truly returned, mercy and judgment would once again be asked to sit side by side. The rumor did not arrive loudly. It came folded inside ordinary conversation and unfolded slowly. A trader spoke of a young man seen near the river settlements, a man who traveled alone and asked careful questions. Another traveler added a small detail, then another, until the shape of the stranger began to form again. In Omuaku, repetition is the first test of truth. By the third telling, the village stopped, pretending it had not heard. The elders met again, not beneath the udala tree this time, but inside the obi where voices could be measured. They spoke of the danger of chasing shadows, and the greater danger of ignoring them. If the man truly existed, and had passed nearby, the village had a duty to itself to know. Judgment without knowledge, one elder said, is like walking at night without a lamp. Okori was sent for, because the matter touched his household directly. He listened carefully, his face calm though his thoughts were crowded. A father protects his child, but an elder protects the village, and sometimes the two stand on opposite sides of the road. He agreed that if the stranger could be found, questions must be asked. Nkiru heard the decision in the quiet of the afternoon, when news often sounds heavier. She did not react at once, because reaction can betray hope. The thought that the man might still be walking somewhere nearby unsettled her more than his absence had. A closed door is easier to lean against than one left open. Obina came to see her that evening, his steps quicker than usual. He told her what people were saying and asked what she felt. Nkiru answered honestly, saying she did not know whether she wanted the man found or forgotten. Obina nodded because uncertainty had become familiar to them both. The elders decided to send 2 men to the river settlements, chosen for their steady temper and careful speech. They were instructed not to accuse, only to ask and listen. A truth dragged out by force often returns with lies. The men left early the next morning, carrying kola nuts and restraint. As they traveled, Omuaku waited in a way that felt different from before. This was not the waiting of fear, but of possibility. Some imagined resolution, others imagined further trouble. A village that waits together rarely agrees on what it hopes for. In the meantime, life continued, because life refuses to pause for clarity. Nkiru spent her days caring for Chidibert, who was beginning to recognize voices and light. The child laughed easily, unaware of how many thoughts circled around his small body. Each laugh loosened something in Nkiru, even as it tightened something else. Women began to approach her more openly now, curiosity softening into concern. They asked about the child's sleep, his appetite, his health. Some stayed longer than before, sharing stories of their own children. Familiarity, once broken, takes time to return. The days stretched, and the messengers did not return quickly. Each evening, people looked down the road with casual interest that fooled no one. Silence filled the spaces where certainty should have been. Even the elders felt the weight of not knowing. On the 5th day, the men returned just before sunset. They did not go home first, but came straight to the Obi, dust heavy on their feet. The village noticed at once, because news always changes the way people walk. By the time the elders gathered, a crowd had already formed at a respectful distance. The messengers spoke plainly, without embellishment. They had met a man who fit the description, a traveler known to pass through villages offering small trade and conversation. He did not deny staying in Omur, nor did he pretend not to remember Naikiru. He gave his name as Issue of Nidale, and said he had not known she was with child. The murmur that followed carried many feelings at once. Relief that the man existed, mixed with anger at his ignorance. Some felt satisfaction, others disappointment, because clarity often arrives smaller than expected. The elders raised their hands for quiet, and asked the messengers to continue. Isu, they said, had not run when questioned. He appeared surprised, then troubled, then quiet. He said he would come to Omuaku, if summoned, but he asked for time to prepare his mind and speak with his people. A man does not walk into judgment unannounced. The elders agreed to send word formally. When Nairo was told, she sat down slowly, as if her legs had finished their work. The name sounded unfamiliar, though she had expected it. A name, she realized, does not restore what absence has already shaped. Still, it changed the weight of the story. That night, she lay awake, thinking of Isu as a person rather than a shadow. She wondered what kind of man agrees to return and what kind delays. She did not feel anger or longing, only a careful readiness. Some meetings happened too late to feel new. The elders prepared a formal message, respectful but firm. Isu was asked to come and speak before them, not as an enemy, but as a man with unfinished responsibility. The message was sent at dawn with clear instructions. From that moment, Omuaku began waiting again, but differently. As stays passé opinions sharpened. Some believed Isu's return would settle everything. Others warned that his presence might reopen wounds that had barely closed. The village divided quietly, not into sides, but into expectations. Obina spoke less during this time, watching instead. He saw how hope crept into Ankiru's posture, despite her efforts. He also saw how quickly hope invites disappointment. Caring for someone, he knew, often meant guarding them from futures they could not yet imagine. When word finally came that Isu was on the road to Omuaku, the village stirred as one. Children were sent indoors, and elders gathered their thoughts. The matter that had circled them for months was finally approaching its center. A road that had carried silence was now bringing answers. Ankiru prepared herself quietly, washing and dressing with deliberate care. She held Chidibera and whispered nothing, because promises made too early break easy. Outside, the village waited, listening for footsteps. The stranger who had once arrived unnoticed was now expected. As the sun dipped low, a figure appeared at the edge of the road. People leaned forward without meaning to. The village held its breath, not in fear, but in recognition that the story was turning, and before the night settled fully, Omuaku would finally hear from the man whose single night had refused to remain in the past. Isu entered Omuaku without drama, his feet steady, his eyes alert but respectful. He did not rush his steps, nor did he slow them to invite pity. A man's manner, the elders often say, announces his intentions before his mouth does. By the time he reached the center of the village, everyone had already decided something about him. He greeted the elders first, bending low, in the way that acknowledged both age and authority. His voice was calm, though it carried the strain of a man who knew he was standing inside another person's memory. He said his name again, clearly, as if placing it where it could be examined. Dene waited, because speaking out of turn is its own kind of disrespect. Ankiru watched from a distance, Chidibera tied to her back, his small body warm against hers. Seeing Isu again did not awaken the night she had tried to forget. Instead, it revealed how much time had passed between who she was then and who she had become. Some meetings are not reunions, but confirmations. The elders asked Isu to speak, and he did not hesitate. He told the story as it happened, without decoration or excuse. He had come as a traveler, stayed as a guest, and left believing the night was only a night. If I had known, he said, my feet would not have carried me away. The village listened closely, because truth reveals itself in what a man avoids saying as much as in what he offers freely. Isu admitted fault without surrendering his dignity. He did not blame youth, palm wine, or fate. Responsibility, he said, was still responsibility, even when it arrived late. When asked about the child, Isu's eyes found Nkiru, and held there briefly. He did not ask for permission to look, but he did not stare either. He said he was willing to claim the child, to perform whatever rites were required, and to carry the consequences of his actions. A murmur moved through the village like wind through tall grass. The elders withdrew to deliberate, leaving the village suspended between outcome and imagination. People spoke quietly, some already forgiving, others still weighing old fears. A known father changed the shape of the taboo, but it did not erase it entirely. Repair, like damage, takes time. Nkiru sat beneath the shade of a mango tree, her thoughts unexpectedly calm. She realized she was no longer waiting to be rescued from the story. Whatever the elders decided, she had already crossed something alone. Strength, she understood now, often grows without ceremony. When the elders returned, their decision was carried in their posture before their words. The village would accept Isu's claim of the child, but not without conditions. He would provide the necessary rites, gifts, and acknowledgments to restore balance. Tradition could bend, but it would not break quietly. Isu accepted the judgment without protest. He agreed to remain in Omuaku long enough to complete what was required. He also said something unexpected, that Nkiru would not be compelled to follow him or bind herself to him. Responsibility, he said, did not give him ownership over choice. The elders paused at this, surprised but thoughtful. After brief discussion, they agreed. A child may be claimed, but a woman is not a parcel to be returned. The village, in that moment, chose not only order, but fairness. The rites were prepared over several days, marked by careful instruction and measured celebration. Offerings were made, names spoken, and the ancestors addressed with humility rather than fear. Chidibert was formally welcomed into the lineage, his place spoken aloud so the unseen could hear. A child without a place unsettles the world, but a child claimed steadies it again. Nkiru stood through it all, neither bowed nor raised above others. She felt the village's gaze shift, no longer sharp but curious. Shame, once loud, had begun to quiet, not because it was forgotten, but because it had been answered. Isu kept his word, completing each requirement without delay. When his duties were finished, he came to Nkiru privately and thanked her for her courage. He did not ask for forgiveness, because some things are not his to request. He only said he would remember what the village had taught him. When Isu finally left Amuaku, it was with a name and a story that would follow him. He walked the same road he had once taken lightly, now carrying weight he did not resist. The village watched him go without resentment. A debt acknowledged loses its power to haunt. Life settled again, though not into its old shape, and Nkiru continued to raise Chidibert within her father's compound, supported openly now rather than quietly. The child grew strong, his laughter returning off into the air. A story that begins in trouble does not always end there. Obina remained nearby, not as a savior, but as a constant presence. He understood that some bonds are chosen after storms, not before. Watching Nkiru move through her days with renewed steadiness, he learned that love does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it waits, patient and unannounced. The elders spoke less about the matter as time passed, though they did not erase it. Stories like this are kept, not to shame, but to remind. A village survives by remembering what it endured and how it chose to respond. Forgetting, they knew, invites repetition, and so Amuaku returned to its rhythms, altered but intact. The night the stranger stayed would always be part of its memory, but no longer its wound. From one broken rule came a harder lesson, and from that lesson, a quieter strength. The world did not end, as some had feared. It adjusted, the way living things must.